She thought changing her name would erase her past. For 2 years, she lived quietly as a waitress in Chicago, until the most dangerous mafia boss in the city looked at her and said the one name she had been hiding from. And that was the moment everything began to unravel. Sometimes the loneliest person in a crowded room is the one who worked the hardest to disappear. Not the one sitting alone at the corner table. Not the one quietly checking their phone. But the person moving silently through the room, smiling, serving, pretending that nothing in their past could ever follow them here. That's how this story begins. Not with gunshots. Not with a crime. Not with a dramatic confession. But with a quiet waitress carrying a bottle of wine across the marble floor of one of the most expensive restaurants in Chicago, and the most dangerous man in the room watching her for the very first time. I've always been fascinated by stories that sit on the edge between danger and tenderness. The kind of stories people call dark romance. Not because they glorify darkness, but because they ask a strange question that most of us secretly wonder about. What happens when someone raised inside a dangerous world decides they want a different life? Can you actually escape the legacy you were born into? Or does that past eventually find you, no matter how far you run? This is one of those stories. And the reason it stayed with me is because it doesn't begin with violence. It begins with something much quieter. Kindness. Picture the scene for a moment. Chicago at night. Rain threatening outside the windows. Inside a place called Salveti's, the air smells faintly of truffles and expensive wine. Crystal chandeliers scatter light across polished marble floors. Conversations float softly through the room, the kind spoken by people who never worry about rent or hospital bills, or whether they'll have enough left at the end of the month. The city's elite come here. Investors, lawyers, politicians, and occasionally, men whose wealth doesn't come from any business you would find listed on a public website. Moving quietly between the tables that evening was a 21-year-old waitress named Lily Adams. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about her. Black uniform, hair pulled neatly back, a calm, professional smile she offered to every guest who raised their hand for another glass of wine. But something about her didn't quite fit the picture. You know how sometimes you notice a person who seems a little too aware of their surroundings? The way they scan the room without turning their head. The way their shoulders tighten when someone unexpected walks through the door. The way they move like someone who has spent a long time learning how not to be noticed. That was Lily. And if you had been sitting in that restaurant that night, watching carefully, you might have noticed something else. Every time she approached one particular table, her hands trembled ever so slightly. Not because the guests were rude. Not because the wine was expensive, but because of the man sitting there. His name was Dante Corsetti. Now, if you've heard whispers about the old families in Chicago, you might recognize that name. Some names carry weight even when spoken quietly, and Corsetti is one of them. Dante Corsetti wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. He was the kind of man who could sit perfectly still in a crowded room and still somehow command the space around him. Tall, dark hair, an Italian suit that looked effortlessly expensive. The kind of confidence that doesn't need to prove itself, and eyes that noticed everything. For 2 months, Lily had served his table the same way she served everyone else. Pour the wine. Clear the plates. Smile politely. Leave. During those 2 months, Dante Corsetti had never once looked at her as anything more than part of the restaurant's background. Until one small moment changed that. But before we go further into this story, let me say something quickly. If this is your first time here, welcome to Rose's Stories. This channel is where we explore stories that live in the space between love, power, and the choices that change people's lives forever. If stories like this intrigue you the way they intrigue me, consider subscribing. Your support helps this channel continue sharing more stories that make us think, question, and sometimes see the world a little differently. Now back to that moment. Because everything changed the second Lily noticed something no one else in that restaurant had. A quiet woman sitting behind Dante Corsetti, trying to get someone's attention. Mrs. Corsetti. Her hands moved gently in the air. Not waving. Signing. Most of the staff simply smiled politely and continued walking. But Lily stopped. And without hesitation, she placed the wine bottle down, stepped closer, and raised her own hands. Good evening, she signed. What happened next lasted less than 3 minutes. A short conversation about risotto. About Naples. About a grandmother's recipe from decades ago. But in those 3 minutes, something very unusual happened. In a restaurant filled with powerful people, expensive suits, and carefully practiced manners, a quiet waitress treated an elderly woman with genuine kindness. And someone else noticed. Dante Corsetti. He watched the entire exchange. And for the first time in 2 months, his attention shifted. Because sometimes in stories like this, the most dangerous moment isn't when someone draws a weapon. It's when the most dangerous person in the room suddenly decides to look closer. And when Dante Corsetti finally looked at Lily Adams that night, he began noticing things about her that didn't make sense. The way she spoke, the way she watched the room, the way certain names made her tense. Within days, he would start asking questions that Lily had spent 2 years trying to avoid. Questions about who she really was. And questions about why a quiet waitress in Chicago moved like someone who had grown up inside a war she was desperately trying to escape. And the strange thing about moments like that is how ordinary they look from the outside, even though they quietly change everything. After that night, Lily Adams went back to doing exactly what she had been doing for months. She worked her shifts, carried trays across the dining room, and kept her head down the way people do when they're trying to blend into a life they built carefully from nothing. If you had walked into South's during those weeks, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual about her. She was just another waitress moving through the room with practiced efficiency. But the more I thought about her situation, the more one question kept returning to me. Why would someone that young live with that level of caution? Because Lily wasn't simply working a job. She was maintaining a carefully constructed version of herself. Every small detail of her life seemed designed for the same purpose. To remain unnoticed long enough to build a future that had nothing to do with where she came from. For 6 months, South's had been the perfect place for that. Restaurants like that create a strange kind of invisibility. The staff move constantly, the guests focus on their own conversations, and no one really looks twice at the people who bring their food. It allowed Lily to exist in plain sight while remaining completely unknown. Outside of work, she attended classes at a small college in the city. Linguistics and international relations. That detail always stood out to me when I first heard her story. People choose those fields because they're curious about how cultures communicate, how people understand each other across different languages and histories. It's the kind of curiosity that usually belongs to someone who wants to connect worlds, not someone trying to disappear from one. Yet in Lily's case, language had another meaning. You could see it in the way she spoke with Dante's mother that night. When Mrs. Corsetti signed to get someone's attention, Lily didn't hesitate. Her hands moved naturally, with the rhythm of someone who had used the language for years. Anyone familiar with sign language could recognize it immediately. That kind of fluency doesn't come from a casual class or a short online course. It comes from growing up around it, from living with it day after day until it becomes second nature. Mrs. Corsetti noticed the difference right away. The conversation between them flowed easily, like two people who had been waiting a long time to be understood without effort. She asked Lily where she had learned to sign, and Lily answered the way people do when they aren't prepared for the question. I grew up with a deaf cousin. It was a simple explanation. Honest, most likely. But what struck me about that moment was how quickly Lily realized she had said too much. Her hands stopped for a second, and you could almost imagine the thought crossing her mind. I shouldn't have shared that. When you're trying to erase your past, even harmless details feel dangerous. Still, the evening ended quietly. Lily finished her shift and returned to the small routine she had created for herself. But 3 days later something unexpected happened. The head waitress handed her an envelope left behind by one of the diners. Inside was a tip much larger than anything Lily had ever received from a single table. And a short handwritten note. Thank you for seeing my mother. DC. That line stayed with me when I first heard the story. Not, thank you for helping her. Not, thank you for serving her. Thank you for seeing her. It suggested something deeper about the man who wrote it. In a world where respect is often performed rather than felt, genuine attention can be rare. For Lily, it was probably just a moment of relief. A quiet kindness acknowledged, nothing more. She went back to work the next evening, assuming that chapter of the story was finished. But 3 nights later the atmosphere inside the restaurant shifted again. The Tuesday crowd was smaller than usual. Lily was refilling water glasses when she felt something many of us recognize immediately. That subtle sensation that someone is watching you. She glanced toward the center of the room. Dante Corsetti was sitting alone. No associates. No conversation. Just him, at his usual table, his attention following her movements across the dining room. Moments later, the restaurant manager passed her and spoke quietly. "Mr. Corsetti would like to speak with you when you have a moment." Then he added something that felt more like a warning than a suggestion. "And Lily, be careful." She approached the table with her notepad in hand, the way she always did. "Good evening, Mr. Corsetti. How may I help you?" Dante didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Lily." His voice was calm, almost polite, but it carried the kind of authority that makes refusal impossible. When she sat down, he looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "I think," he said quietly, "we should talk about who you really are." The moment Dante Corsetti asked that question, the air around the table seemed to shift in a way that only Lily could feel. It's strange how a simple sentence can carry so much weight. From the outside, nothing dramatic had happened. The restaurant still hummed with quiet conversations. Glasses clinked softly. Someone laughed near the bar. Yet for Lily, the room suddenly felt smaller, as if the entire space had narrowed down to the two of them and the quiet challenge hidden inside Dante's words. "I've always believed that the most dangerous conversations are rarely loud. They happen exactly like this, with calm voices and careful observations that reveal more than accusations ever could." Dante didn't rush. The silence that followed. He leaned back slightly, his fingers resting loosely around the stem of his wine glass, watching Lily with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime studying people. That patience told her something important. This wasn't a sudden curiosity. He had already been paying attention. "Your accent slips sometimes," he said after a moment, his tone casual, almost thoughtful. Lily blinked, caught off guard by the comment. "Accent? Boston," Dante replied. "I spent a few years on the East Coast when I was younger. It's hard to mistake." For most people, that might have sounded like an offhand remark. But for someone who had spent 2 years deliberately softening her voice, adjusting the rhythm of her speech, practicing the neutral patterns of Midwestern English, it felt like the first crack in a carefully constructed wall. She forced a small smile. "People say that sometimes." Dante nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the attempt at deflection, but he didn't press the point. Instead, he continued the way someone does when they're slowly assembling a picture. "And then there's the sign language," he said. Lily's fingers tightened against her notepad. "My mother was very impressed," he added. "She rarely meets people who understand her so easily." He tilted his head slightly, studying her expression. It wasn't just sign language. It was Italian Sign Language, a very specific dialect from the South. Not something most interpreters learn unless they've spent time around families who use it every day. I remember thinking about that detail the first time I heard this story. Language has a way of revealing things people don't intend to share. It carries history with it, pieces of a person's life that slip through even when they're trying to stay quiet. Lily understood that too. "It's just something I picked up when I was younger," she said carefully. Dante watched her for a moment longer, then gave a faint nod. "Maybe." Another pause settled between them, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like the kind of silence where both people know the conversation hasn't reached its real point yet. Then Dante spoke again. "You also react when certain names come up." Lily felt the tension move through her shoulders before she could stop it. He noticed. "Names like Flanagan," he continued calmly. "And Ollie. Irish names. Names connected to families that had been operating in Chicago. Long before Lily ever arrived at Southtis. You watch the room when my associate Bianca enters," Dante added. "You check the exits without turning your head." He lifted his glass, taking a slow sip before finishing the thought. That's not something most college waitresses learn to do. By this point, Lily realized something that probably made her chest tighten. Every small habit she thought she had hidden had already been noticed. Every careful adjustment she had made to appear ordinary had still left traces. "You've been watching me," she said quietly. There was no anger in her voice, only a tired sort of recognition. Dante didn't deny it. "I watch everyone," he replied. The answer sounded simple, but it carried a deeper truth. People who live in dangerous worlds don't survive by ignoring details. They survive by studying them. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough that no one at the surrounding tables could hear. "But you," he said, holding her gaze, "are different." For a moment Lily wondered if he already knew everything. If the life she had left behind had somehow followed her here despite all her efforts. Dante tapped the edge of the table lightly with one finger, as if concluding a quiet line of reasoning. "Tell me something," he said. "Is Lily Adams actually your name?" In that instant, Lily felt something inside her carefully balanced world shift. For 2 years she had believed she could outrun the past she was born into. She had built a new identity piece by piece, believing that if she stayed quiet enough, worked hard enough, and kept moving forward, eventually the old world would lose her trail. But sitting across from Dante Corsetti that night, she realized a different truth. Some people don't look for you loudly. They notice you slowly. And when someone like Dante Corsetti starts asking questions, the answers have a way of surfacing whether you're ready for them or not. And once that question was spoken out loud, the fragile illusion Lily had built around herself could no longer hold together. There are moments in life when you realize the past you tried to leave behind has already found you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, through someone who has been paying attention long enough to see through the disguise. For Lily, that moment arrived in the calm, almost unsettling stillness of Dante Corsetti's gaze. He didn't press her for an answer immediately. In fact, what made the situation more unsettling was the patience with which he observed her reaction. The kind of patience that suggested he wasn't guessing anymore. He was confirming something he had already begun to understand. "You changed more than your name," Dante said eventually, his tone steady and almost reflective. Lily didn't respond. "You changed your hair color," he continued. "You changed the way you speak, even the way you carry yourself." He paused, letting the words settle between them. People only do that when they're trying very hard not to be recognized. I remember thinking about that moment for a long time. Because running away isn't only about distance. Sometimes it's about transformation. About reshaping yourself into someone the past wouldn't recognize if it walked into the room. But Dante had been studying Lily long enough to notice the seams. For 2 years she had believed she was invisible. And now someone was quietly unraveling that belief. "I'm just a waitress," she said finally, the sentence sounding weaker the moment it left her lips. Dante didn't laugh. He didn't argue. Instead, he looked at her the way someone looks at a puzzle when the final piece is already in their hand. "No," he said calmly. "You're not." The restaurant continued around them as if nothing unusual was happening. Waiters moved between tables, glasses clinked softly, a pianist somewhere near the bar played a quiet melody. But at that table the atmosphere had shifted into something much heavier. Dante leaned forward slightly. "You're the daughter of Patrick O'Malley." The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. If you've ever heard the old stories about Chicago's underworld, you know that name carries history. Patrick O'Malley was not simply another figure operating in the shadows of the city. He was the head of one of the most powerful Irish families in the region, a man whose influence stretched far beyond the city limits. And more importantly, his organization had spent decades in quiet competition with the Corsetti family, which meant Lily hadn't just been hiding from her past. She had unknowingly been working in the territory of her family's greatest rivals. For the first time since the conversation began, Lily's composure cracked. "My father disowned me," she said softly. The words surprised even her. Perhaps because she hadn't spoken them aloud to anyone in Chicago before. 2 years ago, she continued slowly. "He wanted me to marry into another family. It wasn't unusual in their world. Alliances were often strengthened through marriages arranged long before either person involved had much say in the matter. I refused." Dante studied her carefully. "So you chose exile." Lily shook her head faintly. "I chose my own life." But even as she said it, the uncertainty in her voice revealed something deeper. Freedom is rarely simple when it means leaving family behind. Dante leaned back again, considering the idea. "You walked away from power," he said quietly. "Most people spend their entire lives trying to reach it." Lily's gaze dropped to the table. "You don't understand what my family is like." Dante's expression changed in a way that suggested he understood more than she expected. "Oh, I understand your family very well," he replied. Then his tone shifted slightly, the calm observation giving way to something more serious. "Which is exactly why this conversation matters." For a moment Lily thought he was going to continue questioning her identity. Instead, he said a different name. "Sean Flanagan." The effect was immediate. Lily looked up sharply. Flanagan had been part of her father's organization for as long as she could remember. In many ways he had been a permanent figure in her childhood, always standing just behind her father during meetings, speaking quietly with him at family gatherings. What about him? She asked. Dante's eyes hardened slightly. He's been building relationships with people your father would consider enemies. Lily frowned. That doesn't make sense. Power struggles rarely make sense while they're happening, Dante said calmly. There are signs your father's control over his organization has weakened in recent months. He paused before adding the part that changed the entire situation. And Flanagan has been preparing to replace him. Lily felt the words settle slowly in her mind. Replace him. In their world, that phrase only had one meaning. How? She asked quietly. Dante didn't soften the truth. By arranging an assassination. The noise of the restaurant faded in Lily's ears, because she suddenly understood the scale of what he was describing. If Patrick O'Malley died and the Corsetti family was blamed, it wouldn't just be one man's death. It would ignite a conflict that had been waiting beneath the surface of Chicago for years. Two families, two networks of loyal men, and a city that could quickly become the center of a war no one truly wanted. Why are you telling me this? Lily asked. Dante's answer came without hesitation. Because you know Flanagan better than most people still alive. You grew up watching him operate. Then his voice lowered slightly. And because he already knows you're here. Outside the restaurant windows, rain had begun to fall against the glass, blurring the city lights into streaks of silver. Lily followed Dante's gaze toward the street. Across the road, a dark sedan sat quietly with its engine running, watching. And in that moment Lily understood something she had been trying not to accept. She hadn't escaped her past. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to find her again. And the moment Lily understood that the car across the street wasn't just parked there by coincidence, the quiet life she had built in Chicago began to unravel faster than she could stop it. There is a particular kind of fear that comes when you realize the past has finally caught up with you. Not the sudden panic of a loud threat, but the colder realization that someone has been searching long enough to find exactly where you tried to disappear. Lily had spent 2 years convincing herself she had slipped out of that world unnoticed. She had changed cities, changed her name, softened the edges of her identity until it blended into the ordinary rhythm of student life and restaurant shifts. But the dark sedan waiting outside the restaurant window told a different story. Someone had been patient. Someone had been watching. Dante noticed the change in her expression immediately. He didn't ask whether she understood what the car meant. He simply followed her gaze toward the street and nodded once, as if confirming what they were both thinking. They've been there about 20 minutes, he said quietly. That detail alone carried weight. 20 minutes meant the surveillance hadn't just begun when Lily looked outside. It meant someone had already been inside the restaurant, asking questions, confirming that the person they were searching for was really here. Before Lily could respond, a waitress from the bar approached their table carrying a dessert menu she didn't need. She placed it down between them, pretending to wipe a spot from the tablecloth. But when she leaned closer, her voice dropped to a whisper. There's a man at the bar asking about you. Lily felt the tension travel through her chest. He showed the bartender a photo. The waitress continued. Irish accent. Scar above his right eye. The description hit her like a memory she had hoped never to hear again. Declan, she said under her breath. If Sean Flanagan was the strategist behind her father's organization, Declan had always been the man who carried out the difficult work no one else wanted to handle. Lily remembered him from her childhood the way children sometimes remember distant storms. Always present somewhere in the background, dangerous even when he wasn't speaking. The fact that Declan himself had come looking for her meant this wasn't just a casual search. Flanagan believed Lily was valuable enough to track down personally. Dante rose slowly from his chair. To anyone watching from across the room, his movements would have seemed calm, even casual. But Lily noticed the subtle shift in the way he carried himself, the controlled readiness of someone preparing for something unpredictable. There's a service corridor behind the kitchen, he said. It connects to the building next door. Lily stared at him. You've planned this already. Dante gave a small, almost amused shrug. I plan many things. He reached into his jacket and slid a phone across the table toward her. It was simple, unmarked, the kind designed to leave no trace behind. Take this, he said. My driver will meet you at the back entrance in 5 minutes. He'll take you somewhere safe until we understand exactly what Flanagan is trying to do. For a moment Lily didn't move. The phone rested between them on the white tablecloth like a quiet decision waiting to be made. 2 years earlier, she had walked away from her father's world with nothing but a small bag and the determination to build something different. Every class she attended, every shift she worked, every careful step forward had been part of that effort. And now she was being asked to abandon it all again. "My roommate," she said slowly. "My classes. People will notice if I disappear." Dante's response came with unsettling certainty. "Your roommate will receive a message saying you had a family emergency. Your professors will receive emails asking for extensions. And the restaurant will assume you decided not to return." Lily looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant understanding. "You've already arranged all of that?" Dante met her eyes. "If you walk out the front door tonight, Declan will be waiting." His voice softened slightly, though the seriousness in it remained. "This isn't about convenience, Lily. It's about staying alive." For a long moment, she stared at the phone, feeling the fragile version of her life in Chicago slipping through her fingers. Then a question escaped before she could stop it. "Why help me? You don't owe me anything. In fact," she added quietly, "I'm the daughter of someone your family has fought for years." Dante's expression shifted just slightly. "My mother likes you," he said. "She hasn't stopped talking about the girl who took the time to speak with her." Then he paused. "And because I've watched you." Lily frowned. "What does that mean?" "I've watched you stay after your shift studying until the restaurant closes," he said. "I've watched you donate half your tips to the shelter down the street." He held her gaze. "And I've watched you treat people with a kind of respect most of the men in my world have forgotten." Before Lily could answer, Dante's phone vibrated in his hand. He read the message quickly, his expression hardening. "They're moving," he said. "Go now. Through the kitchen. Down the corridor. Last door on the left." A black SUV would be waiting. Lily stood slowly, the phone in her hand, now feeling less like an object and more like a turning point. For 2 years she had believed she could live outside the world she was born into. But as she stepped toward the kitchen doors, one thought followed her. You can run from a legacy for a long time, but eventually you have to decide whether you're going to keep hiding from it, or finally turn around and face it. And sometimes, facing that legacy means walking straight back into the place you once escaped from. 3 weeks after the night Lily slipped out of South's through the kitchen corridor, she found herself standing near the Chicago docks, staring at a warehouse that looked painfully familiar. Places like that exist in every major city. Old industrial buildings near the water where shipments arrive and disappear, where conversations happen quietly and agreements are reached without paperwork. To most people, driving past, it would look like another forgotten structure waiting to be redeveloped. But Lily knew better. For families like hers, warehouses like this had always been meeting grounds. Neutral spaces where business discussions took place, where conflicts were settled before they grew into something worse. Neutral territory, at least in theory. But that night the word neutral felt fragile. Lily sat in the passenger seat of Dante's car, watching the dim lights inside the building and the figures moving slowly near the entrance. Some belonged to her father's organization. Others were positioned farther back in the shadows, part of the quiet security Dante had arranged around the perimeter. The air carried the smell of the lake and cold metal. "You can still stay in the car," Dante said after a moment. His voice wasn't forceful. If anything, it sounded almost protective. Lily shook her head. "If I don't go in there," she said, "this ends with people dying." That was the reality they had uncovered during the weeks since she left the restaurant. The files Dante's team had gathered told a story far darker than anyone in her father's circle had realized. Financial transfers routed through offshore accounts. Messages exchanged with Russian contacts who had no reason to be involved with the O'Malley organization. And at the center of it all was Sean Flanagan. For years he had stood beside Patrick O'Malley as a trusted lieutenant. But the evidence showed something different. A quiet strategy unfolding over months, weakening her father's influence while preparing to replace him. Tonight's meeting was supposed to finalize that shift. Flanagan planned to eliminate Patrick O'Malley and blame the attack on the Corsetti family. The result would have been immediate retaliation, drawing both organizations into a conflict that would have spread far beyond Chicago. Lily understood that better than anyone. She had grown up watching how easily loyalty could transform into violence once suspicion took hold. "I need to speak to my father first," she said. "If he sees the evidence before Flanagan moves, we might still stop this without everything falling apart." Dante studied her carefully. In the weeks since bringing her to the lakeside safe house, he had seen her struggle with the decision she was about to make. Walking away had been painful enough. Walking back into that world carried a different kind of weight. Your father may not believe you, he said quietly. Flanagan has been at his side for decades. I know, Lily replied. But he deserves the chance to hear the truth. She stepped out of the car before doubt could slow her down. The warehouse door opened into a dim corridor that smelled of salt water and oil. Every step inside stirred memories she had spent 2 years trying to bury. Childhood visits when she had followed her father through rooms like this, learning the subtle language of trust and negotiation that governed his world. At the end of the hallway, a small office door stood partially open. Voices drifted through the gap. Her father's voice sounded older than she remembered, worn by the years she had been gone. Across from him stood Sean Flanagan, speaking with the calm confidence of a man who believed everything was unfolding according to plan. Patrick, he was saying, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey onto the desk between them. We've known each other too long for secrets. The Italians are preparing to move against us. Tonight's meeting is just a distraction while they position their people. Lily felt her pulse quicken as she watched through the opening. Flanagan slid one of the glasses toward her father. But before Patrick O'Malley could lift it, Lily noticed something that made the world narrow into a single moment. Flanagan had added something to the drink when her father looked away. There are moments in life when hesitation disappears. Lily pushed the door open. Don't drink that. The room froze. Her father stared at her as if he had just seen someone return from the dead. Lily, he said, his voice breaking with disbelief. For a second the past seemed to collapse into the present. Then Flanagan moved. His hand dropped toward his jacket, his calm expression hardening instantly. She's with the Corsettis now, he said sharply. Can't you see what this is, Patrick? They're using her to divide us. Lily stepped forward, placing the flash drive on the desk. Look at the files, she said. Bank transfers. Messages with the Russians. Orders to eliminate Tommy and Sean. Her father hesitated. Flanagan lunged for the drive. And in that instant the room exploded with movement as guards reacted on both sides. But before anything could spiral out of control, another figure stepped from the shadows near the doorway. Dante Corsetti. His presence was calm, almost unsettling. In its certainty. It's over, Sean, he said. Patrick O'Malley began reading the evidence on a laptop one of his men placed in front of him. When he looked up again, the expression in his eyes had changed completely. Cold, focused, and finally aware of the betrayal that had been growing beside him for months. In that moment, Lily realized something about the world she had tried so hard to escape. Sometimes the only way to prevent destruction is to step back into the place where the truth began. And when the truth finally surfaces like that, the world rarely returns to the way it was before. 6 months after the night at the warehouse, the city of Chicago looked the same to anyone passing through. The lake wind still moved between the tall buildings. Traffic still crawled through the same crowded streets. Restaurants like Salt's still filled with quiet conversations and expensive dinners. But beneath that familiar surface, something had shifted. The fragile tension that had existed for years between 2 powerful families had been quietly rewritten. Sean Flanagan vanished from that world almost as quickly as his betrayal had been exposed. Officially, no one spoke about the details. In circles like those, explanations are rarely written down or discussed in public. People simply understand when someone who once held power suddenly disappears from the picture. Patrick O'Malley, however, made a decision that surprised many people who had known him for decades. Not long after that night, he stepped away from leadership. Years of responsibility, combined with the realization of how close his organization had come to being dismantled from within, had forced him to see something he had ignored for too long. Power held together by loyalty alone can crumble quickly when that loyalty is misplaced. He returned to Ireland, leaving the organization in the hands of Lily's older brother with one clear instruction. No war with the Corsetti family. It was a decision that quietly reshaped the balance of the city. 2 families who had spent generations viewing each other as rivals found themselves maintaining something far more valuable than dominance. Stability. And Lily watched all of this unfold from a place she never imagined she would end up. On a calm afternoon months later, she stood in the garden of the Corsetti family estate overlooking the water. The place was far removed from the noise of the city, The kind of quiet property where the past felt distant enough to breathe. Dante's mother was in the garden that day, carefully tending to rows of roses that had grown there for years. Her hands moved gracefully through the air as she spoke in sign language, explaining something animatedly to a small group of Dante's associates who were attempting to follow along. The scene had an almost peaceful quality to it. Men who once spent their days managing complicated negotiations now stood awkwardly repeating hand gestures, trying to keep up with the older woman patiently teaching them how to communicate without words. It had been her idea. If the next generation of the organization was going to build something different from the world they inherited, it would start with learning how to listen to one another in new ways. Lily watched them for a while, quietly absorbing the strange calm that had settled over her life. The journey that brought her there still felt unreal sometimes. 2 years earlier, she had been a college student trying to disappear inside a crowded restaurant, hoping that if she stayed quiet long enough the world she came from would forget her. Instead, that world had followed her. And somehow, instead of destroying everything she had built, it had forced her to face the very thing she had been running from. Dante stepped beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're thinking again," he said. Lily smiled faintly as she accepted one of the cups, just wondering how differently everything could have turned out. Dante followed her gaze toward the garden, where his mother continued signing animatedly. "Different," he said after a moment, "but not necessarily better." That was the strange lesson hidden inside Lily's story. Sometimes the paths we try hardest to avoid are the ones that eventually teach us who we really are. Lily turned toward him, realizing something that had taken months to understand. She hadn't escaped her past. She had reshaped it. The family she came from, the life she thought she rejected, the world Dante belonged to. All of it had collided in a way that forced everyone involved to reconsider what loyalty and power actually meant. In stories people like to call dark romance, the focus often stays on the danger. But to me, the more interesting part has always been what happens after the danger passes. When 2 people who grew up inside complicated worlds decide to build something different from the patterns they inherited. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come from running away. Sometimes it begins when someone is brave enough to face the truth, and someone else is willing to stand beside them while they do. And that's the part of this story that stayed with me long after it ended. Not the conflict, not the power struggles, but the quiet moment months later when a woman who once tried to disappear stood in the sunlight of a garden, realizing that the life she had feared might destroy her had instead led her somewhere entirely unexpected. If you've stayed with me through this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you think about endings like this. Do you believe people can truly escape the worlds they come from? Or do you think the real challenge is learning how to change those worlds once we understand them? Stories like Lily's stay with us not because of the danger or the power struggles, but because they quietly remind us how complicated human choices can be. For 2 years, Lily believed the only way to survive was to disappear. She changed her name, changed her life, and tried to build something ordinary in a world far away from the one she was born into. But the truth is, no one can completely erase where they come from. Our past shapes us, teaches us, and sometimes even chases us until we are forced to face it. What made Lily's journey meaningful wasn't that she ran away from her world, but that when the moment came, she found the courage to step back into it for the right reason. She didn't return for power, revenge, or control. She returned to prevent destruction and protect people who might never even know the role she played. And in doing that, she changed the outcome of a story that could have ended in violence. The deeper lesson here is something that applies far beyond this story. Many people spend years trying to escape uncomfortable parts of their lives, past mistakes, family expectations, difficult environments, or identities they wish they could leave behind. But growth rarely comes from pretending those things never existed. Real strength comes from understanding them, learning from them, and deciding how they will shape the person you choose to become. Lily didn't allow the world she came from to define her, but she also didn't deny its influence. Instead, she used what she knew to change its direction. That is a powerful reminder that our past does not have to control our future, but ignoring it will never set us free. So here is a simple question for you. Do you believe it is truly possible to escape the world you come from? Or do you think the real challenge is learning how to transform it? I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Please share your opinion in the comment section so everyone watching can read different perspectives. And if you enjoy stories that explore these deeper human choices, consider subscribing to the channel to support us and give us the motivation to continue bringing you more meaningful stories in the future.